The sun was sinking low over the rolling fields of Iowa, a pale orange light filtering through the dust that hung like mist over the road. The train had left them miles behind. Now, a group of Jewish prisoners of war trudged in silence, their striped uniforms stiff with sweat and earth. They were no longer soldiers, no longer anything but bodies that moved forward because stopping meant collapsing. Their boots were torn, their breath shallow, their stomachs empty. Flies circled around the slow ones. The air smelled of soil and distant smoke, the kind that made a man's throat tighten from memories he wished to forget. One of them, a tailor from Krakow named Eli Weiss, murmured under his breath, "Where there is kitchen smoke, there is fear." Another, Corporal David Rosen, once an artilleryman, turned his hollow eyes toward him and managed a bitter smile. "Then we are surrounded by ghosts." No one laughed. They had learned long ago that laughter could make hunger worse. It was April 1945. The war was ending, though none of them knew how or when. They had been captured in France, passed from camp to camp. Until now, they found themselves in the American Midwest, a place too quiet, too clean, too open to be trusted. Rumors said these fields belonged to kind people, that Americans treated prisoners well, but rumor, to men like these, was another word for danger. A truck rolled past, raising a slow spiral of dust. Inside sat an American guard, his rifle resting loosely against his leg, his eyes not cruel but tired. The prisoners followed the sound of the engine until it faded into the wind. Then silence returned, the kind of silence that grows heavier with every heartbeat. When they reached a crossroad, the group stopped, on the horizon. Smoke rose from a farmhouse chimney. The sight should have brought comfort, warmth, food, life, but instead, it twisted their stomachs tighter. Every smoke meant fire, and every fire meant memory. One of them, the youngest, whispered, "Maybe they will let us sleep in the barn." Another shook his head. "Maybe they will shoot us first." From a distance, the sky burned red, like the front lines they had left months ago. Somewhere behind them, Europe was collapsing, and they could feel it in their bones, the end of something vast, the ruin of everything known. But here, on this foreign road, the only thing left was movement, step after step, dust after dust. They no longer believed in flags, uniforms, or prayers. Above all, they no longer believed in smiles, for too many times. A smiling man had opened a door that led to death. As the last light of day bled into the fields, their shadows stretched long and thin like memories refusing to die. If you value stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. It helps preserve forgotten chapters of history. Share your location and your local time in the comments below. Where are you listening from tonight? The wooden door creaked open with the kind of sound that makes every man's heart stop. The prisoners froze where they stood, boots half buried in dust. Their breath caught somewhere between fear and disbelief. A rectangle of golden light poured out from the farmhouse doorway, spilling across the porch, cutting through the late evening chill. Inside, they could see the flicker of a fire, the faint shape of a man tall, broad-shouldered, his sleeves rolled up, hands rough from labor. He looked at them for a long moment. The only sound was the wind brushing over the cornfields, the quiet rhythm of crickets waking in the distance. Then he spoke, voice calm, ordinary, almost fatherly. "You men look hungry," he said. "Come inside. We've got enough." The words did not fit the world they knew. They waited for the trick behind the kindness, for the shout, for the rifle to be raised. But none came. The man just stood there, one hand on the doorframe, the other holding a lantern that trembled slightly in the breeze. Behind him, the smell of cornbread drifted out, butter, grain, smoke. It struck them harder than any bullet could. Inside the house, a woman's voice called, "Who's there?" "Henry," he answered softly. "Soldiers, just boys, I think." Boys, no one had called them that in years. Eli's stomach clenched. His brain, conditioned by months of cruelty, screamed to run. He thought of the camps, the guards who offered food only to watch men fight each other for crumbs. He thought of the signs that said, "Work makes you free," and the lies that had always followed kindness. But the farmer's eyes, clear, gray, steady, carried no deceit, only concern. Behind him, A small kitchen glowed like another world. The table was already set. 2 bowls of soup steamed beside a loaf of bread. Half eaten, the fire crackled. Wood popping. It was a sound too human to belong to war. The farmer stepped aside, motioning with his head. "Go on, now," he said. "No tricks. My wife can't stand to see anyone hungry." No one moved. The air was heavy, dense with disbelief. David whispered, "Is this America?" Eli shook his head. "No, this is something else." The man waited, patient as the night itself. He didn't shout or plead. He simply stood there, as though kindness were the most natural language he knew. Finally. One of the prisoners took a single step forward. His leg trembled. His lips cracked from thirst. The floorboards creaked beneath his boot as he reached the threshold, the invisible line between captivity and something he no longer had a name for. No music played, no words were exchanged, only the sound of fire, the breath of wind, and the heartbeat of men who realized for the first time in years that mercy could wear an ordinary face. The invitation hung in the air like a trap disguised as kindness. The prisoners stood motionless, their bodies stiff, eyes darting between the door's golden light and the cold ground beneath their feet. Suspicion was no longer a habit, it was survival itself. Every instinct screamed that safety was a lie. That warmth was the bait before cruelty. Eli whispered hoarsely, "Every invitation hides a trap." His voice cracked, carrying the exhaustion of men who had forgotten what trust felt like. The others nodded faintly. Their eyes were hollow, shaped by memories of false promises and polished boots outside iron gates. In their minds, they could still see it, the gas chambers disguised as showers, the bread that led to selection lines, the guards who smiled before beating men to death. They had seen kindness used as a weapon too many times to believe in any light that came from a stranger's house. The farmer waited, still silent. His wife had appeared behind him, wiping her hands on her apron, her hair touched with gray. She said nothing either, only looked at the men with an expression they could not read, not pity, not fear, something older, something steady. The wind shifted, and the scent of stew reached them thick with potatoes and onions. The youngest prisoner, a boy named Jakob, barely 19, stared at it like a ghost seeing sunlight. His lips moved soundlessly, maybe praying, maybe remembering. Still, no one entered. The American guard at the end of the path leaned on his truck. Watching the scene unfold, he didn't interrupt. He just spat the dust from his mouth and looked away, as if he too sensed that something sacred was happening, something fragile that would break if anyone spoke too loudly. Eli's hand tightened around the sleeve of David's uniform. "If we step inside, we're fools," he whispered. David answered, "If we don't, we stay ghosts." The silence deepened. Even the crickets seemed to stop. In that pause, the audience can feel time itself hesitate, suspended between fear and faith. Finally, the farmer spoke again, softly. "You can stand there all night if you want, but the soup's getting cold." The sentence landed like a quiet explosion, simple, domestic, almost absurd in its normalcy, and yet it pierced through years of indoctrination and terror. The men looked at each other. Could a man truly offer soup to those the world had tried to erase? No one answered, but something invisible shifted. A single heartbeat of doubt cracked the armor of distrust. Inside the house, the woman turned back toward the kitchen, and through the window, they saw her lay out extra bowls, 1, 2, 3. It was not a command. It was faith, expressed through routine. Outside, the prisoners stood frozen, caught between the trauma of memory and the impossible invitation of mercy. And for a long, aching moment, the war felt very far away. The woman stepped fully into view now, her figure framed by the warm light behind her. Her apron was faded, her hands red from washing, her face lined not with age but with years of weather and work. She looked at the prisoners as if they were simply men who had walked too far, too hungry, for too long. No judgment, no questions. "My mother used to say," she began softly, "when one more hungry soul sits at the table, the room feels warmer." Her voice carried through the yard, breaking the silence that even the crickets had stopped respecting. She turned to the small boy beside her, perhaps 7 or 8, and said, "Jimmy, fetch another chair." The boy nodded, his hair catching the firelight as he disappeared behind the door. When he returned, dragging a chair almost his own size. The wood scraped along the floorboards with a long, echoing sound. "I'll sit next to them," he said, barely above a whisper, but loud enough to make one of the prisoners blink in disbelief. It was the smallest gesture imaginable, a child making space, but it shattered the invisible wall between them in that moment. The line dividing captor and captive blurred. The boy's innocence reached where no political treaty or sermon ever could. Eli stared at the child, his throat tightening. He hadn't seen a child up close in 3 years. The last one he remembered had been running across the ghetto street with a piece of bread before being caught. That image had haunted his sleep every night since. But here stood another child, offering a seat, not a weapon. The farmer's wife motioned toward the table. "You can wash first," she said, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. She handed them a towel, still damp from the basin. The touch of clean cloth against their cracked hands felt almost sacred. David took it first, his fingers trembling as he wiped the dirt from his palms. He whispered, "When was the last time we washed before eating?" Eli didn't answer. He couldn't. The boy, curious and fearless, looked up at them and asked, "Are you soldiers?" Eli nodded after a long pause. "We were," he said, "a long time ago." The child seemed to consider this, then smiled. "Papa says soldiers are tired men who need soup." A faint laugh escaped someone, the first sound of life among them in days. It wasn't loud, but it was real. The farmer smiled too, quietly proud. He turned to his wife, who was already ladling stew into the extra bowls. Steam rose into the golden light, swirling like ghosts of another world being set free. No one gave orders, no one saluted. The rhythm of war paused, if only for an instant, to let something older, something human take its place. As the chair settled into its new spot, a breeze swept through the open door, carrying the smell of bread, hay, and forgiveness. They sat, not as soldiers or prisoners, not even as strangers, just as people caught inside the same fragile moment. The table was small, built of rough pine, its surface marked by years of knives, flour, and sunlight. Sisat. The farmer's wife placed bowls in front of them, one by one, her movements slow and careful, as though afraid to startle the spell holding the air together. No one spoke. The only sound was the quiet orchestra of supper spoons clinking against ceramic, bread tearing softly, the hiss of the fire. For men who had lived in a world where metal meant violence, this was a sound too gentle to comprehend. Eli lifted his spoon. His hand shook so badly that the first sip spilled down his wrist. The warmth of the soup startled him. It was real heat, not the metallic taste of camp broth. The flavor potatoes, onions, milk rushed through him like memory, awakening parts of himself he had buried to survive. David stared at the steam rising from his bowl, watching it curl like ghostly smoke from the past. He whispered, "The first time I heard this sound, I thought it was gunfire." The farmer looked at him, and now David hesitated, then smiled faintly. "Now I think it's prayer." The room was heavy with silence again, but it was no longer fear, it was reverence. Even the child, Jimmy, seemed to understand that something holy was happening. He kept his eyes fixed on Eli's trembling hands as if watching someone learning to live again. Outside, the wind brushed against the windows. Inside, the light flickered across faces that had forgotten gentleness. In the corner, the farmer's old dog slept by the hearth, unconcerned by the visitors, as if recognizing peace long before men could. One of the prisoners, a tall, gaunt man named Samuel, who had barely spoken since capture, set down his spoon and whispered, for the first time, "The sound of metal kills no one." The words froze everyone. The farmer looked down, his hand resting on the table. The woman paused mid-movement. Even the fire seemed to quiet for a breath. The statement didn't need explaining. It was the kind of truth that hangs in the air and binds everyone in its gravity. The clock on the wall ticked. Each second felt louder than the last. Samuel leaned back, eyes wet but unblinking, and said softly, "Maybe peace sounds like this." No one contradicted him. No one dared to. Outside, night had fully arrived. The stars hung above the Iowa plain, sharp and clear, untouched by war. Inside that small farmhouse, 6 prisoners and 1 family shared what the entire world had forgotten: stillness, warmth, and the miracle of safety. If you were sitting at that table, what would you have felt? Fear, gratitude, disbelief, or all three? Tell me in the comments below. The meal neared its quiet end, the bowls half empty, the fire burning lower. The air felt softer now, like the walls themselves were exhaling after years of holding their breath. The farmer leaned back in his chair, rubbing his palms together to brush off crumbs, and looked at the men across the table, faces still cautious, but no longer hardened. He said it almost casually, as if speaking to himself. "We don't know what hate is," he murmured, "so we just cook a little extra for strangers." The words landed with the weight of something eternal. No sermon could have struck deeper. No commander, no general, no rabbi had ever said it so simply. His wife smiled faintly. The kind of smile that comes from living long enough to know kindness isn't weakness. She didn't look at the prisoners as victims or guests, only as people who were hungry. For a moment, no one replied. Even the ticking of the clock sounded distant, like time itself had paused to listen. Eli blinked hard. His mind raced back to Europe, to the shouts, the boots. The hate shouted loud enough to fill the sky. And here, in a quiet American farmhouse, a man said he didn't even know what hate was. It felt impossible. It felt like healing. David looked up from his plate. "You really didn't know who we were?" The farmer shook his head. "Does it matter?" The question lingered. Outside, the night wind swept across the fields, carrying the faint hum of distant machinery tractors that would plow the same soil tomorrow, as if the world had never burned. The prisoners exchanged glances, uncertain whether to laugh or cry. It wasn't that they didn't understand the language. It was that they had forgotten this one, the language of decency without agenda. The boy, Jimmy, yawned and leaned against his mother's arm. "Papa," he said sleepily, "are they our friends?" His father reached over, tousled his hair gently, and answered, "Anyone who eats at your table is..." The sentence drew something unspoken from the prisoners. For the first time in years, they felt included in the word anyone. Outside, an owl called across the cornfields. Inside, bowls were stacked, chairs pushed in, the smell of soup and firewood mixed with the faint sweetness of cornbread cooling on the counter. Eli thought, they didn't save us with guns, but with spoons. The irony was almost too much to bear. The farmer stood, stretching his back. "Tomorrow, if you're up early, you can help me fix the fence," he said. "A fair trade for supper." The men nodded, unsure if this was mercy or equality or both. He looked around the room once more, as if memorizing the sight of peace in wartime. Then he added quietly, "Hate's a word folks invent when they forget how small the world really is. Tell me, do you think kindness can unlearn hate faster than war can teach it?" The morning after the meal felt unreal, as if the night before had been a dream stitched together by exhaustion. The prisoners rose early, stepping into the cold dawn where mist clung to the fences and the world smelled of hay and dew instead of smoke. For the first time in months, they hadn't been woken by shouting or fear. The farmer was already in the yard, checking his tools, the brim of his hat catching the first streaks of light. Eli walked toward him, unsure what to say. Words had always been weapons or lies in his old life. Here, they seemed unnecessary. The farmer simply nodded, handing him a hammer. "You ever fix a fence?" Before Eli looked at the wood, smiled faintly. "I've built coffins," he said. "Then you'll do fine," the farmer replied, not missing a beat. "This is for keeping life in, not death out." As the hours passed, the men worked alongside the farmer, pulling wire, driving stakes, mending gaps. Sweat mixed with dust, and for once, it felt clean. The boy Jimmy followed them, carrying nails in a small tin bucket. He hummed tunelessly, a sound that made even the most broken man forget the weight of memory. At noon, the farmer's wife brought out sandwiches wrapped in brown paper, and they ate sitting on the fence they'd just repaired. No guards, no orders, just wind, bread, and silence. The prisoners looked at one another, realizing that this might be the last day they would ever feel normal. When the trucks came a week later, carrying orders for transfer, none of them spoke during roll call. The guards called names, clipped and cold. Yet when Eli turned for one last look at the farmhouse, he saw the family standing by the porch, the man, the woman, and the boy waving. The smell of bread drifted faintly from the kitchen window. He raised his hand in return, a gesture that once would have felt impossible. Years passed. The war ended. Some went home to ruins, others to silence. Eli, now an old man living in Haifa, kept a folded piece of paper in his Bible, a letter written in the farmer's handwriting. "You are always welcome at our table." He never managed to write back, but sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, he would close his eyes and see that wooden chair the boy had pulled for him slightly crooked, one leg shorter than the rest. He could still hear the spoon against the bowl, the murmur of firelight, the boy's small voice saying, "I'll sit next to them." In 1978, Eli returned to America. The farm was gone, replaced by flatland and modern houses. But he found the same horizon. He stood there as the sun set, feeling the same wind that once carried the smell of cornbread. "They didn't teach me love," he whispered. "They just let me eat beside them." The sky turned gold, then faded into violet. Somewhere, far beyond time, the kitchen light still burned. The story of that farmhouse in Iowa is not written in official histories or carved into any monument, yet it survives in the quietest corners of human memory. It reminds us that history's greatest shifts do not always happen in war rooms or on battlefields, but sometimes at kitchen tables where strangers share bread. The Jewish prisoners who walked through those doors did not find ideology. They found something rarer, ordinary decency, unshaken by propaganda or fear, in that modest home. War's logic collapsed, and humanity, stripped of banners and commands, spoke in the language of soup and silence. Years later, as the world rebuilt itself with new flags, treaties, and divisions, few remembered that such small acts once held the power to heal. But perhaps that is the way compassion works, quiet, unrecorded, passed like warmth from hand to hand. The farmer and his wife never imagined themselves as symbols. They were simply living by instinct, guided by a moral compass older than politics. And the men they fed carried that memory further than any sermon or speech ever could. We like to think history belongs to generals, to speeches, to victories. Yet sometimes it belongs to a nameless child who pulls up a chair for the unwanted, and in doing so, saves a fragment of the world's conscience. That boy, who knew nothing of hate, became a keeper of something larger than war, could destroy the belief that goodness can exist without reward. In every age, there are still doors waiting to open, still tables waiting for an extra plate, still moments when mercy asks for no permission. The story of those POWs and that family is not just a memory, it is a map for how the human heart can survive even the darkest decades. So tonight, wherever you are, imagine that small farmhouse glowing against the twilight, the wind through the cornfields, the quiet of peace rediscovered, and a wooden chair still slightly tilted, waiting for whoever needs it next.